Okay, welcome to episode 129 of an Evolving Man podcast. Today I'm excited to be speaking to Mark Staufer. Mark is an experienced ghostwriter and copywriter with a passion for helping clients tell their stories authentically and powerfully. He specializes in preserving personal legacies, organizing complex life stories, and crafting engaging narratives. He is also the writer of The Lost Boys of Dilworth, a prime-time docu-drama which recounts Mark's own experiences at the notorious New Zealand boarding school during the 1970s. Welcome, Mark.
Nice to be here, man.
Yeah, bless you. When I watched your documentary a few weeks ago, one, I was in tears, and then, as I said before we began, I was so much anger. It's like another story of just horrific abuse. So I'd love for us to begin a little bit of what drew you into writing your story and, what happened.
Well, it's so funny because not funny, but tragic, because I guess I've carried this story around with me, and as a writer, I have never written it, and it's not a story. You're not at a party and you go, "Oh, did I tell you I was abused in boarding school?" Not, it's not like that. So you lock it away in this little house in your brain. And unfortunately, the little house has windows and doors, and the story escapes a little bit, every so often. But a couple of my closest friends, and after New Zealand, I went to LA. I was a screenwriter there for nearly 20 years. And a couple of my friends who know me well said, "Why don't you write this story about Dilworth School? Because you lived it, and the most incredible story." And I think subconsciously, because I'd locked it up in the house in my brain, I dismissed it. And then I think maybe 3 or 4 years ago, the story started, kicking down the door and climbing out the windows. And so I thought, okay, I'm going to put it down. So I wrote a screenplay about my life at Dilworth and then sent it off to a few production companies in New Zealand and got a few bites and then found a production company and we went through a process and in the end we decided we want to make a docudrama about it, which meant that it was the documentary part of it was interviews and all that sort of stuff, and then the drama part I had to write about my actual days at Dilworth. In some ways it was more painful because then I had to fly to New Zealand and I was interviewed about what exactly happened, and at the same time writing about the little vignettes in between. And we finished making the doco, and I returned to my hotel room. I was there for like a fortnight, and I collapsed and was the most awfully sick I've ever been in my entire life. And of course, I've spoken to a few friends about it since then. They're like, yeah, of course, you're expelling all the pain and frustration. At the time, I was like, I've got the flu, I've got some horrible dysentery problem or whatever. Um, and arrived back here in Amsterdam and then had to still work with the production company on the docudrama. Shall we say this? Should we do this? What about this? Blah, blah, blah. And I literally collapsed. And for 6 months was in a fetal position on this couch right here. Couldn't operate. My kids had to look after me. I was in so much pain. And still it's not clicking to me. And then the realization, obviously, now after a bit of therapy, a bit of like thinking about it a little, talking about it to friends, um, this is something I've carried around my head for, I'm 62, so it happened when I was, 10, 11, 12, 13, 10, 11. So for half a century, I've compartmentalized this story of my abuse at this goddamn boarding school, deliberately. I think in some ways I've boarded up the windows when it starts sneaking out. I've double locked the doors when they start creaking open, and I've just hidden from it, and then ran off into the forest when stuff started escaping. I don't know how that metaphor's working, but eventually it caught up with me. and eventually just completely knocked me over for 6 months of my life. And I drank and I just knocked myself out because, self-medicating is the easiest way to deal with stuff. If because if you go to your doctor, he's going to prescribe bad things, and I didn't want that. So I thought, well, vodka is a better way of dealing with this. Let's just self-prescribe that. And only after 6 months or so did I sort of come out of this haze of self-loathing and retribution and just just hatred. Um, and a lot of it was because I was like, for 50 years, you've hidden this away. What sort of coward are you? Why why have you done this? There's been a lot of self-recrimination, I think.
Mm, thank you. That's very common for us, I think, as Pete Walker in his book Complex PTSD says, and that's my sense in listening to others, is like boarding school is complex PTSD. It's not just one instance of PTSD, it's repeated over and over again, breaking the attachment with mum or dad and going back to school. He says it's like that inner critic. We are just so vicious. I mean, mine in my 20s, when I started to challenge this, I physically beat myself.
Yep. Yeah, I understand
Coach.
it. Yeah, 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 yeah. And it's funny actually because I had some therapy, which is something I've always been a little leery of. I guess it's kind of an ignorant Freudian thing. It's like, oh, they're all like, it's like, oh, did I want to fuck my mother or something? I don't, all that sort of stuff. But anyway, quite a smart therapist said to me, "You've got PTSD."
Mm,
And I sort of came home a bit shocked about this because I always have thought of that in terms of I haven't been in Iraq, It's like,
yeah.
how do I have PTSD? And my girl, I announced this to my girlfriend. I didn't announce it. I sort of whispered it to my girlfriend. She's like, yeah, duh. And then there's this recrimination because I'm going, so I've just been wandering around with this for like 50 years or something. I haven't realized. So I'm not only kind of I'm also stupid. I'm just not very smart. So there was all of that to go through. It's kind of
Mm,
it's ridiculous. And it feels like a massive release when you realize all the shit and get on with it.
Yeah, yeah. It sounds like that inner critic, you know, the recriminations again, I think it's really common for us. It's almost when we want to heal, but it's almost like it doesn't want us to. So it's like, no, 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 don't do that, because that's how we kept safe.
Yeah, yeah. It's almost like the dark and the light fighting in your brain or your soul or whatever it is. And but you come out at the end of it a completely different person and with a realization that there are bad people and there are, and so I guess I've been traveling through life all this time after what happened to me at school, kind of viewing everybody in a very jaundiced fashion, knowing that, having trusted and liked certain people when I was at school, that they're actually fundamentally evil. Because the problem I have with abuse is this: it's like if I had some strange sexual peccadillo that didn't involve hurting somebody terminally, then that's okay. I don't care what anyone does, right? But however, when and all these people are smart, they're not retarded. All these people know that what they're about to inflict upon a kid is probably going to screw them up for the rest of their lives. They're so overpowered by this that they still go ahead and do it. And that to me kind of blows my mind. It's I can't imagine doing something like that to any other human being, right? I can't.
Yeah. And Dino Nocivelli, the lawyer, child sexual abuse lawyer, he says it's rare that an abuser just abuses one child. Well, I think he said he's never met anyone who's only abused one child. They always go on to abuse
Yeah,
others.
yeah, it's a disease, and I think especially at Dilworth, I mean, what's come to light is, there's been two inquiries, one major one into it, another one sort of peripheral, is that, more than 300 boys from the 1950, about 1950 on to, I was there in the early 70s until the 2000s, more than 300 boys were sexually abused And I mean, I can't remember. Nine of these guys have been jailed.
Mm.
And the worst thing for me, it's something I can't get out of my head, is that of the boys who are abused, 39 have committed suicide. So you got 39 suicides because of the actions of these guys. And in the back of their mind, somewhere, there must have been some little guy saying, you're screwing this kid's life up.
Mm. 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 Yeah, and it's interesting. I see so many similarities between my boarding school and yours. And
Mm,
it was interesting when someone told me about your show,
mm.
the documentary, and I looked it up and I had a conversation with someone from my school, and they said that the headmaster of Dilworth had come to my boarding school, talked to some of the teachers, and then some of the teachers from my school had gone to Dilworth I think it was in the 90s.
Right.
And
We know who went. Yeah.
yeah, and certainly six of my teachers have spent time in prison. I think there's possibly more who were caught later on in other schools, and I can't remember how many people have come forward. I think it's about 30 so far. Although there's a lot who haven't gone public with it. And so there's so many similarities between the two, but they're in totally different parts of the world, and it's
Yeah.
kind of cool.
From what we can tell from, looking back on all this time, and even when I was at school, there were definite kind of little cliques of masters or tutors or whatever you want to call them who were involved in this. And in fact, some of the kids were handed around, and we found out this subsequently. And Yeah, it's not no mistake that that these two schools got together. They're organized, and I mean, it's despicable, but yeah, they were attracted to Dilworth for that reason. And then the headmaster, I don't know who the headmaster was, but I mean, I went to him on numerous occasions saying that, I was being abused by the chaplain, by the minister. And I was caned and I was put on. We had a thing at Dilworth called Coventry, which I don't
Mm.
know. Did you have that? I mean, it's an old English saying. When the king got pissed off with you, he'd send you to Coventry, so send you out to the countryside where no one knew who you were and whatever. At Dilworth, it was no one was allowed to speak to you. No one was allowed to acknowledge you, even in class. So in effect, for a kid, you're a ghost walking through the corridors for, it was usually only 24 hours. I was put on Coventry maybe 10 times for days. And so no one was allowed to speak to me, acknowledge me, ask me a question in class or whatever. And if they did, they were then put on Coventry as well. And that to me was the most painful of all because, caning's caning. It's over. Off you go. Even it doesn't matter how sadistic caning is, and it was pretty sadistic at Dilworth. Uh, Coventry was really painful. It's like hyper
Oh.
COVID.
Well, yeah, it's like neglect on an extreme scale. I think
You're
these
right.
schools are neglect, full stop. But to ignore, you know, I think there's so many levels for me. One is there's lack of touch in these schools, appropriate touch, like hugs.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
That's kind of neglect. But then to just totally ignore you, that you don't
Wow.
exist. I mean,
It is the strangest feeling, especially when you're 10 or 9 or 11, that as I mean, I always equate it to you, the ghost who walks. You're just no, everyone almost, it's leprosy in it to a certain degree. And if there's any acknowledgement there put on Coventry as well, it's terrifying. And I spent a lot of my time at that school on Coventry, also in a way to try and shut me up, right? Because I was trying to whistleblow, I was trying to alert everybody to what was going on. And so the way they sorted it out was they just shut me up.
mm. So if we go back to the beginning, because I think one of the things I loved about the docudrama is you begin with your mum, saying, right, this wonderful opportunity to go off. And then what really touched me, because I've heard this many times, is she said, if you really hate it, I promise you can come home.
Yeah. So, I mean, Dilworth is an interesting school actually, and set up probably in the best intentions, and set up in 1906, I think, in Auckland. And the guy who set it up, James Dilworth, was a multi-millionaire property developer, farmer, real estate owner in Auckland, and he died without having any kids. So his wife set up a school that was designed for kids who mostly didn't have dads. So were growing up in situations where there was in poverty, and with no male supervision. For me, my mother was a solo mum, and I was a bit of a. I mean, listen, there's no pretension here. I was not a very good kid, but but for her, it was the ability for her to be able to work full time, right? Instead of like looking after a 9-year-old or an 8-year-old, you couldn't just leave us alone. And so getting into the school where all your education, your board, food, uniforms, hockey sticks, whatever, were taken care of, was a dream come true for her. And of course, I didn't want to do this. What child would? But for a mother or father, it's the most amazing opportunity ever, and that's what they prey on to a certain degree. So, as a kid, as a young boy, the one thing you the one thing that you really want is male companionship, right? You want an older male role model. That's just a natural thing, and so of course that's what they preyed upon, the masters and the tutors there, and that's why we come back again to the cluster of pedophiles, because they've got these kids who are dying for affection, who are dying for a male influence, and and uh, and so we're sitting ducks to a certain degree.
Mm. That first night, again, I think in the drama you mentioned something along the lines that it was the most emotional experience you had, like being in that dormitory.
Yeah.
What happened for you to suddenly go, this is not a safe place?
Yeah, a lot of things. Of course, coming from I lived in a state house and only hung out with two-bedroom house with my mother, tiny little bedroom, and then being thrust into a dormitory with, you know, 15 to 18 other boys, and like having to shower naked in front of all these other kids with the masters looking on, and then just being the strictness of it, going to bed now, this is the time, lights out, and then lying in this kind of in this huge dormitory with other kids crying and thrashing about, and then other kids yelling out shut up, and then other kids snoring, all that sort of stuff. It was just such an alien experience. And of course, this was I was terrified and kind of curious to a certain degree. I'd never experienced this before, but it was a realization that this life, you're going to be told when to breathe, when to eat, when to sleep, when to get out of bed. And the masters were always there. And it was that big brother feeling to a certain degree, I think, that there was no escape. There weren't bars on the windows or anything, but this was life. You couldn't get up and go to the toilet in the middle of the night. They'd prefer you wet your bed so then you could be humiliated the next day, right? There was stuff like that. And I think that the realization happened for me that night, that first night when I was lying there in the darkness, listening to all these sounds, and the masters coming and going and just, saying shut up or go to sleep or whatever it was, that that I was completely powerless, and I had no option, and it wasn't going to get any better than this.
Mm. Mm. Wow. I think in the series in the docudrama you mentioned about dorm raids as well, about these
Yeah, yeah.
boys coming in and
It was,
and
yeah. I mean, it was, and I think always bring up this kind of cliche of Lord of the Flies,
mm,
but the tutors would come and go during the night and then go to, they'd be in bed themselves by, 1 a.m. or 12. And I don't know what time. But then there was the bullying factor, right? So there was a lawlessness about the law. And the law said that there can be lawlessness when there's no adult around, and whatever you want to happen happens. Um, and so there was bullying at night. So there'd be raids on beds where you'd be beaten and kicked and thumped, and then the kids would run off into the night. And so the bullying factor was the next kind of, it was the icing on the cake of humiliation and fear and pain to a certain degree, because you didn't have just one enemy. Your enemy was in the jungle with you and you couldn't see them. They were camouflaged. And so, I mean, you soon learned who the bullies were, but there was this second tier of rule. So, of course, the masters and the tutors, um, who carried the canes and had the authority, but below them were the bullies. And that was more painful in a way because it was hard to understand how there wasn't more of a kind of a there wasn't more of a we weren't the allies against what was happening above us. There were these other kind of, you know, people involved that were on their side. And it was a humiliation ritual, not every night, but most nights.
Mm. And the teachers did nothing
No,
to.
that's the other thing. You couldn't report it. If you did, you were labeled worse, and worse would happen, and a blind eye would be turned. It was not, there was no ability to, yeah, there was no way you could report anything.
Yeah. George Orwell talks about that, and I had a similar thing in my school, is that the unwritten rule is that you do not grass, it's like
No, we called it pimping for some reason. And I learned
pimping.
what pimp meant later on in life. I couldn't quite work out what it was, but if you pimped, you were dead. And
Mm,
as I said, so the bullies ruled the roost.
mm, mm. What type of things? Because obviously you show that in TV show, some of the bullying which happens, but I'd love you to describe to the audience what are some of the things which happened bullying wise.
Yeah, I mean, there was physical pain. So there was, a quick knee to the groin or a punch in the chest or whatever when you passed by. But I think for me, I don't mind that. It's like bring it. It's not. I don't mind a bruise. The worst thing was this ostracization, which kind of locks into the Coventry thing I talked about. But just wandering through the corridors, going to school, going to class, whatever it was, and just being kind of left out, and with that combination of punching and raiding at night, and humiliation and sadism. And I think for me at that age, I couldn't get my head around. Um, I mean, it was like this baptism of fire that the that kindness didn't exist in this realm. So it was, as I say, the the bullying I found from fellow kid, older, bigger, stronger, was I found really hard to get my head around. And it took me kind of a year or so to go, oh, I get it. They're just assholes. And then it's like, well, whatever then. And then I got to the stage where I really could give a shit. But up until that point, the most painful thing for me was the fact that this kid I didn't know for some reason hated me, and I couldn't work it out. And I remember asking, as I was being held up against the wall or beaten in bed, why are you doing this? And it's just the response is laughter or whatever. And that to me was the hardest thing, the the mental anguish of the situation, rather than, it's hard to explain, rather than the physicality. I didn't mind being caned, well, I did, but being caned or slapped or kicked or thumped. But it was this whole rethinking of the order of life and of human beings was the most difficult thing for me.
Mm. Yeah, it's really interesting. It's like the physical and the mental. It's like,
Yeah,
how do we survive this?
yeah, yeah. No, you're exactly right. And it's
Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah, I mean, the bullying, I think when I kind of reflect on my time, I worked out very quickly that I couldn't trust people. So my defense mechanism was just not to talk and give off that passive aggressive that if you come near me, then I'll hit you. I never did. Well, I did actually hit some people, but not publicly.
right,
But I kind of got that reputation. I found that helped to keep people away. That it was almost again the mental, but that kind of that fear. Um, but I worked out very soon, a quick. It's like, oh, I can't trust anyone here, so I'm not going to have friends.
right.
Just going to stay away, keep an eye out,
Yeah.
and people
And
worked
then
out.
that adds to it, right? Because you're the loner, it's that kid on his own, and you're on your own because you're surrounded by assholes who
Yeah.
are and trying to achieve the same thing in a way. They want the approbation and the love of the bullies who are adults. And so you get cast out, you're the leper, and then after a while there's a comfort zone there, and it's you'd rather have that you know than be involved in any of this other kind of evil shit that's going on, frankly.
Mhm. So, at what point did did you become aware of these teachers who were, the paedophile teachers? When did that come in that it was like, okay, we not only got the bullies, but there's something else happening here?
Yeah, I mean, I think that it was a gradual process, which now we recognize as grooming,
Mm.
and so my abuser was, and remember, I wasn't really, I'd seen some signs of it, and I guess my very young brain didn't really understand what was going on, but there were kids who would disappear at night from the dorm, and then a tutor would come and get them, and then they'd return. Um, because I've always been a bit of an insomniac, so I'd be awake and see it, and and it was like kind of very weird to me. Like, where are you going with Mister What's his name in the middle of the night? Um, but the chaplain obviously took a shine to me, and so was very very kind. And for me, that was amazing. I'd never had any male influence on me before. It was, my mother and my aunt and my grandmother brought up by them. And so for a man who, was, showed interest in me was quite an amazing thing. And it made me realize to this day how important it is, two parents. You can look. My mother did a reasonably good job for some of it, bringing me up. But the fact of the matter is, I truly believe it's a male and a female who bring up a kid. That's just the way it is. We do different things. We're great at different things. But I mean, that was my realization that I had a craving for, a bloke to kind of exert some influence on me, teach me, throw a ball with me. God, just teach me about books, communicate with me, give me a hug every so often, and that's the realization, obviously, later that all those guys there knew that, they were there and they provided all that succor so that they could groom. They weren't being paternal. They were grooming. And of course, you don't know any of this at the time. And so the guy who groomed me was the chaplain, and showed me a lot of attention, and then just it's quickly slid into sex, and so and even at the time, I wasn't really my I couldn't quite comprehend what was going on. It's like, is this what happens? Is this the next step of a relationship that, a fatherly relationship? But I kind of started realizing that it couldn't be because it was I really hated it, and and he was forcing himself upon me. And so I went to the headmaster and reported it, and was literally put on Coventry for a week, and caned and told to shut the fuck up and to never say anything about this to anyone again. Um, and so the headmaster then, I mean, it's so bizarre thinking back on it, right? But the headmaster then put me he decided that I needed a sponsor. I needed someone who's going to look after me and guide me in my journey through the school. And of course, that sponsor, the guy who was going to guide me, the paternal figure, was the chaplain. And so threw me back to him. And this guy was getting, more violent, more needy, more. Yeah, I mean, it's stuff that I sort of still lock away in that house and put bolts on the doors. The physicality of it, but but then again I complained, and then again the same thing happened, and then my only recourse was to get expelled
Mm.
because I realized that the only way I'm going to get out of here, it was hell, and I wasn't going to escape. And so then I started playing out quite badly, doing very bad things, leaving in the middle of the night the school grounds, which is we called French leave, and just, not going to class, hiding in the woods, all that sort of stuff. And this went on for quite a while until, I was caught several times, and each time I was like, this is it, man, I'm out of here. They're going to expel me. And in the meantime, my mother kind of ignored the whole situation. She didn't want to hear about it. She shut me down. And in hindsight, it's because she was so desperate for this school to work out for me, right? And then also a couple of times she was called in about my behavior. And I thought, this is it. They're gonna, my mother's gonna say, this is, I'm taking my son away from here. But that didn't happen. And I realized later, after talking to some other old boys, that it was because they lied to her. They didn't say that I was, reporting abuse or doing it on purpose. It was because I was just playing up, and I just needed stricter discipline and all that sort of stuff. So in the end, my final thing was, I thought, okay, I'm going to go to the press, and Dilworth had but one phone in the entire. It was old rotary phones, right? You remember them,
I
Baker's
do.
iPhones, yeah. One phone in this courtyard area where we lined up to go in for dinner, in for meals. And so I first of all I had to get I decided the newspaper I was going to call, which was the Sunday News, which was kind of a kind of a rag, but I thought I'm going to get a response from them. But I had to get their number, right? This is the days of phone books. There were phone books in Dilworth. There was like one phone book. I had to go to set it up and go into the matron's office, rip the page out of the phone book, and then in the middle of the night, sneak in out of the dormitory into this little phone booth, dial the number, and then report what was going on. And the night it happened, I dialed the number with the page rustling in my hand, and someone answered, and I think I worked out what I was going to say. It was along the lines of, I'm calling from an Auckland boarding school, and I want to report sexual abuse. I don't even know if I said sexual, probably not abuse. And then this hand came in, hanged up the phone, and it was a tutor. And then the next day, I was in the principal's office, and hallelujah, I was expelled.
Wow.
But the Sunday News reporter evidently called around just because I mean, let's say there's 20 boarding schools in Auckland, right? So he got that and called around all the boarding schools. But my mother came and picked me up in her Anglia, and down we drove away from the A-frame of Dilworth. And I remember looking out the back window crying, and just feeling, this is it, man. I'm finally away from this hell. And my mother sort of sniping at me, stop crying. You've just ruined our lives, kind of thing. But still never wanted to hear about it, right? Never, just didn't want to hear. And that it ruined my relationship with my mother.
Mm,
for the rest of my life, which I feel, as I said, because they lied to her about what I was, you know, I thought they were saying, well, Mark says he's being abused, and in actual fact, they were saying Mark's playing up and being a bit of a dick at school, you know. And so I think that's the one thing I regret the most is
mm,
that it ruined the relationship with my mother.
mm. Interesting. Similarly, I didn't talk to my mother and my father for a number of years, and it was really my wife who kind of really helped heal that relationship
Right.
with my mother. And now I have a good relationship with her, but
Mm.
my father passed away, and he was ex-boarding school, my father as well,
Right.
you know. So yeah, that feels a lot better having kind of healed with my mother. But there was one time I remember having a discussion with her and she didn't want to listen, so I just started to scream at her. And she listened for the first time ever, about what had gone on in this school. And so,
Yeah.
yeah.
But,
So,
but for me, it was subsequently finding out that in actual fact, there were dozens of boys whose mothers were became involved, and then the school lied to them. And just at that, innocent time, you don't you don't sort of understand the whole adult kind of conspiracy of it all. You know, it's amazing.
mm, mm, mm,
I mean, I guess we go through a lot of that stuff, don't we? Though, if only we knew then what we know now, it would
mm.
have, I would have blown it up a lot earlier, you know?
Yeah, and it's like I've heard this over and over again. It's like that adults don't listen to children, you
No,
know. And I mean, I mentioned I worked at a boarding school in Australia after I left my boarding school in the UK.
right.
And I knew what was happening with the kids. I knew what they thought of the teachers. I knew the nicknames they had for me and all of that. And therefore, it made me realize that the teachers knew about the paedophiles at my school, as the teachers in your school will have known what is going on.
There's no doubt that everyone knew what was going on when I think back on it.
Mm,
And then subsequently, in terms of evidence given at the inquiry and what have you, that it was plainly, clearly obvious that it was a hotspot for this sort of behavior, and that everyone, all the pedos in the school, were handing kids off to each other, you know? It's and as I say, that's one of the things that breaks my brain to think about that sort of behavior, you know? I just don't think I can't imagine treating a child in that way. And it's not just because I'm a dad. I couldn't having doing something that impacts another human being to that extent is I mean it's worse than torture, right?
mm, mm, mm. Yeah,
But
yeah.
mm,
And it lives with you for the rest of your life. Oh, unless, obviously, you mentioned those 39 people who committed suicide. So,
right.
at what point did it start to come to the surface, Mark, that it was like, right, was it enough people who kind of came forth and then the inquiry
Right.
was started? What was that process? When was that?
Well, it's interesting. It's I mean I've I left New Zealand at the age of 25, and I've
Mm,
lived in, in the States and London, and now I'm in Amsterdam. But that was part of the compartmentalizing of my brain to a certain degree. And I really believe that now looking back, I had to get out of that goddamn place, right? And so I was not really paying attention deliberately to a certain degree, I guess. And then maybe, I don't know, 6 or 7 or 8 years ago, the cops opened an investigation into it because I think so many kids had come forward, kids, they're not kids now, they're 50, 60-year-old men.
mm,
And as I said, 300 victims. And we know, you and I especially know that 300 is probably twice that, right? And they just haven't come forward, right?
My understanding now is it's Alex Renton says it's 1 in 9 who come forward.
Right. That's horrifying. That's horrifying.
It's absolutely horrible. And I've heard from my school when they put out that the school had come forward, a statement of acknowledgement. One of the guys who was leading it, he got 1,000 emails, 1,000 emails from
Right.
people about
Yeah.
abuse.
It's funny you say that because that well, I'll talk about that in a minute. But I think that the cops just were getting so many reports that they opened an inquiry into it, and that's when it started. And that's when these, they started arresting old tutors. And these guys are now in their not well, they were in their 80s,
Mm.
So a couple of them died, and then it all started coming out in the inquiry and whatnot. The the thing that and just harking back to what you said a couple of minute ago, um, the thing that really impacts me is that I also think back on my life, and probably because I'm inquisitive and curious, and the all the women I've been out with, eventually we get to speak intimately, and I haven't told them very much about what happened to me, but I don't know, maybe 80, 90% of those women have been told me that they've been abused in some way. And so at some stage, it all clicked in after I went back and after I started, reliving it all, that we have a planet with maybe 80% wandering around living abuse that they've never spoken about. And it just really makes me think that, well, this is why everything's so fucked up in society, right? You've got these people, everybody bearing this cross of abuse, and it's a horrifying thing to think about. If you're living with that every day and you can't talk about it and you kept it secret, and even if it's subconscious.
Yeah. Yeah, I've heard that. I think it might be again Alex Renton saying that whereas physical violence was easier to tell other people, sexual abuse, because of that shame involved, a lot of people just didn't speak up about it.
Yeah,
And
yeah,
it's often in that, Judith Herman, psychiatrist who wrote Trauma and Recovery, says it's often the third or fourth decade. It's almost like we've pushed it down, we've
yep,
dissociated, pushed it
yep,
down. I often have clients come to me, been very powerful, they've done really well, 20s and
yep,
30s, and then they get to a point they can't do it anymore.
yeah, yeah.
Squashed, associated. It doesn't work. They've got to find an authentic way rather than this false dissociated self. So,
Right. But if you think about, everyone in power has been through that.
mm,
There's a psychopathic edge to humankind, right? If we're treating
mm,
and we're just talking about the people who are victims rather than then all the people who've carried this out. It's kind of terrifying when you think about it. The percentage of humankind who've suffered or abused. It kind of answers a lot of questions about why everything's so fucked up in this world.
yeah. And I get a sense, that's my feeling, is it's really changing. I feel that there's a great book by a Dutch man called Rutger Bregman called Humankind. I recommend reading it.
Mm,
And it's all about how we get the perception it's a really bad place. And he actually is saying that actually humanity is a very good place. It's very kind and loving. It's just that we are taught this through the media. A lot of the media are ex-boarders or, got some form of trauma. And he puts a lot of science into it. It's just fascinating, very heartwarming
right.
book and a lot of hope, really.
Mm.
Um, so what happened with Dilworth then? So the inquiry, you had two inquiries. Did that suddenly change everything? You would have thought the school would have to close down with
Yeah,
300
I mean,
people.
that's what I would have hoped, that it would be closed down and turned into a like an Auschwitz of abuse. So you go and as a museum and looked at it. But no, it's still operating, and it had an inquiry, and they made recommendations, and the promise is there that of course we've changed and there's safety now and all that sort of stuff. But there's no guarantee of that whatsoever. They had a redress program where they were paying out kids who'd have to go in front of a panel. I say kids, but men my age, go in front of a panel and get grilled and then get awarded, $50,000 or 100K or whatever, except for obviously the 30 or so who were dead. And I didn't take part in that. We're suing them separately. Um, and so it's business as usual. Dilworth is a massive conglomerate. The Dilworth Trust doesn't just run this school of 400 kids. It is a real estate empire worth about $2 billion. So it's a massive enterprise. And in some ways, I can't help but think how to hide, how would you hide shoddy bookkeeping and nasty kind of perfidious real estate gigs, but with a beautiful charitable school. Except I think that I mean one of the things we're determined to do is to get their books opened, right? Which they haven't done because they're a charitable trust. But in terms of the property development side of things, is to open their books, and they're fighting that quite strongly. And I mean, it's obvious what's going on to me. So yeah, no, I mean, look, business as usual,
Mm.
sadly.
Yeah, yeah. What's your vision for 5, 10 years regarding Dilworth? What would you like to see happen?
Well, look, I've been pretty hardcore about it in terms of, I mean, there's a whole lot of different thoughts about, from old boys in terms of what what should happen to them. What is the penance, How do we do? And there's been, talk about let's have statues for the unknown abusee and on the grounds and all that sort of stuff. I mean, that to me it doesn't really achieve anything. They've apologized, doesn't achieve anything. As I say, it doesn't help the 30 boys who were so traumatized that they killed themselves. And so after kind of battling them, and I haven't been the main battler in this, you should talk to my friend Neil, who has been fighting these guys for nearly 10 years, and has a lot more information than I do about it. But I've come to the conclusion, and this sounds a bit hardcore, but that the only thing that hurts them is money.
Mm, mm,
And so we're going after them for a lot of money. And obviously, it's not. Unfortunately, it's not the states, right? If it was the states, it'd be all be over already, and we'd be wandering around, multi-millionaires. Yeah, there's a lot of New Zealand kind of legalese that needs to be worked through. But I think that this all points to the fact that they're hiding their books and something's going on there, and and for them, in a way, the pedophilia and the rape and what have you is a lesser evil than what's actually going on in their books. And so this is what we're aiming at. We want the books open. We want to see what's going on. Um, yeah, I mean, for me, it's at the very least, this school is still operating as it has been for 150 years or whatever it is. And this, I don't know that there's been any change. All this stuff could still be going on, but there's been no. We just don't know. And at the very least, I've kind of asked for somebody to be put in, into the school as a independent arbiter of day-to-day life there. But they're fighting all this, of course. So we just don't know, Piers. I mean, it's ridiculous in a way that there's been a lot of as I say, apologies, etc. But nothing really counts for anything. Words words are meaningless.
So it's almost like the money side of things. I mean, I'm seeing this in the UK during COVID. Quite a lot of the prep schools closed because they couldn't stay open.
Yeah,
And what's happening in the UK is that it used to be 1% of the population would go to boarding school. Now they're looking for uh, people from other countries to come. So now it's about 0.5%
right.
of their pupils come from the UK and 50% come from abroad.
Yeah, yeah,
So Africa, Asia,
yeah.
Russia.
Yeah, it's similar to Dilworth actually, because when I went there, it was basically, a white New Zealand European school,
Mhm.
and now I think it's nearly half Pacific Islanders, Maoris. And remember, they're not paying anything to go there,
Mhm.
but one thing that's happened with all this the publicity about what's been going on, I think the more educated population are going, I'm not sending my kid there. Thank God. So if we've achieved nothing, we've achieved that. However, they're making up the numbers in other ways. They'll always find somebody to go there. It's a free education, as I said. It's free food and board, and unfortunately, that's a necessity these days. In
Mm,
terms of there's a lot of people living on the poverty line.
yeah,
But we've no way of knowing if the same shit is going on now as was when I was there in the early 70s.
yeah, yeah. I mean, they say that it's 27 years before you do actually disclose. So if your abuser's you're 10, you won't be,
Yep.
you'll be 37.
Yeah, yeah. And listen, that's so interesting because the inquiry was from the 1950 to I think 2000. And my thing has always been, how do we know this isn't happening now? They say
Mm.
it's not, but in some ways, even all those kids at the school, it's like a prison camp. They're not aware of anything that's going on in the outside world. I don't know if that was your situation at boarding school, but it feels like a prison,
Oh
that
yeah.
there's no contact with the outside world at all. And are the parents paying any contact, notice of it? I don't think so. I don't know. It's
Well,
just it would be horrifying that, as you said, in 30 years from now, there's another inquiry.
yeah. I mean, my sense with these schools now is that they do have DBS, even though I've heard just in the last week or two that DBS is, I think it's something like 70 to 80% of people who had clean DBS, which is the criminal record.
Right.
Um, 70 to 80% of those have then, I can't remember if they've sexually abused people,
Mm,
something like that. So it's a system which isn't really working. But my sense is that it's less the teachers now, but it's more peer on peer. That you've
yeah.
got 17 or 18-year-old boys
Mm,
who are then preying on the 11 or
yeah.
12-year-old girls
There was.
because
Yeah. Sorry, Karen. Yeah. Yeah.
there's just one teacher
Yeah.
or 50 students. They can't. And there's so much paperwork now that they just can't do it. They
Yeah.
can't
Yeah.
keep an eye.
That was definitely the case at Dilworth. In the inquiry found this that there was a lot of peer on peer abuse. And I mean, that didn't happen at when I was there in terms of sexual abuse. But bullying is abuse, right? So
Yeah.
there was definitely that. But it all came down from the top, right? If you've got someone turning a blind eye, so you had no one to go to, it was just survival mode the whole time. And that's what I remember about the place. I was in survival mode 24/7. There was no respite. I couldn't go to bed and go, put a little cage around me and so it was always sleeping with one eye open. And then, it just got worse. It got worse. I was going to say it got worse during the day, but it was just as bad at night. So that has to have some sort of effect on you, right? If you're a kid and you're in survival mode the whole time, fear,
Mm.
and you know that there's no respite from it, there's no one you can go to. You can't tell your mother because she doesn't want to hear it. Um, there's no tutor or master or whatever to talk to about it. You're just in the situation where every second of every single day, you're terrified.
Yeah.
And
And that for me is one of the reasons, these institutions need to close. Certainly pre-16. I think after 16, if it's heart-centered, if it's emotionally intelligent, great. But pre-16, it's like it just doesn't make any sense. And one of them is there's so much fear in these
yeah,
schools, so much pressure. I'm hearing people going into these schools now saying that these kids are suffering with burnout because they have 80, 90-hour weeks. I mean,
yeah,
they're 11 or 12 because there's so much pressure. But when you're in fear, as Bessel van der Kolk, the Dutch psychiatrist, says, there's no activity in the brain.
no,
So
you're learning.
immediately your
Yep,
IQ goes down.
yeah, yep, yep, yep.
And that was me. I thought I was stupid at this school.
Mm, mm. You're
And actually, it was
every waking minute thinking about how you're going to get through to the next minute, right? Who's going to
exactly.
punch you in the face? Who's going to kick you in the nuts? Who's going to, which teacher's going to be sadistic towards you? It's just survival.
Yeah, and on Maslow's hierarchy of need, that's the bottom level.
Yeah,
You don't
yeah.
think about, cognitive ability. So I mean, I have so many kind of reasoning why I feel certainly my vision is 10 years is they will all close under 16. One, I just feel they're going to become obsolete.
Yeah,
Leadership is moving from this real IQ command and control to emotionally intelligent leaders. Boarding schools do not teach anything about emotions. They can't because they're breaking the attachment with the parents.
yeah.
So I just feel they're going to become obsolete. That's my vision. I think it's really exciting times that parents are going to decide with their money and just go, no, I'm not going to send. It doesn't make any sense. If I want my child to really succeed in life, they need to be emotionally intelligent. They're going to not get anything of that in one of these schools.
No, I bloody well hope so. I mean, something has to happen. I think you're right. Just it's close them down and start again. And I mean, that's ultimately what I'd like to see with do it. Just close the fucking place down, open it up as a museum of abuse, and people can tour through and read the names on the wall. 300 kids who are, the 30 kids who committed suicide and whatnot. And it's a learning. It's a learning trip for kids. This is what we used to do. What used to
Mm-hmm.
happen. Here's a cane. We used to beat people with this bloody thing. Um, Ultimately, this we've got to burn it all down.
Yeah, and I sense it's changing now, and I really it's exciting times. There's a lot of movement in the UK. You know,
Yep.
we still don't have mandatory reporting in the UK,
Mm,
meaning, if you're sexually abused and you know that it's happening, nothing happens to you
right.
if you don't report it. Whereas in most countries, developed countries,
Mm,
that is the case.
mm,
Um, but also, yeah, closing these schools out, it's exciting. Certainly in the UK, we're starting to do a research project looking at the impact of these schools, and yeah, I next couple of years is really exciting. So thank you for your courage in putting this message out there, because certainly I was really touched by the Lost Boys of Dilworth. It was a very harrowing watch,
mm,
but also very heart opening. I was in tears quite a few times. Of like,
mm.
can resonate with that when French leave running away, and yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, if I mean, I think that there is this what I've noticed in terms of being in contact with all the other old boys who have been through what I've been through. There's a definite camaraderie and there's a definite sense of humor as well with it. If you've been through what we've been through, you can actually make jokes about anything. And that's one of the kind of the bridges between us, which I love. Um, and so we have that bond, very a unique sense of humor that only us share because we can joke about anything because we've been through the worst and just this experience that we've all been through. And I think
Mm.
it's important we share the stories.
I definitely, I'm hearing this over and over again. It's like that's how we heal, by sharing the stories now. And what we were taught at these schools was not to speak up, and now it's like no.
Yeah.
And I love that more and more people are writing biographies, are speaking up, and it's time for change, and I really feel that's happening. So,
Yeah, and I would encourage people to write about their experiences. I
mm,
mean, as a ghostwriter, I help people write about their experiences. But for me, it started because of I wrote about it, and now I feel whole. And up until now, I realized that I was wandering around with half a life. And when you write about it, when you get into it, it's painful, and you'll lie in a fetal position on the couch for about a few months, but at the end of it you'll get up and you'll wander around. You won't be a baby anymore, and it's a really powerful thing to write your story down.
thank you. Any last words before we complete, Mark?
No, all I would say is I think that a lot of people talk about courage and bravery for coming forward and telling your story. It at the time you don't even think about that. And I got sort of sick of people patting me on the back and saying, "Oh, you're so brave coming forward." It wasn't bravery. There's just becomes this moment where you can't shut up anymore. You've got to tell it, and you don't think you're brave, and you don't know what's going to happen after you do it. And actually, just be prepared. It's painful because uh, articulating what happened to you even all these years later, decades later, is a really painful experience. And so prepare yourself for that. Just surround yourself in good people, those who know, and allow them to look after you a little bit, you know? It's a
Mm,
that part of it's a nasty journey. That's the worst part of the journey is the telling of it later, I think. It's even worse than what happened to you.
yeah, yeah, yeah. Thank you. Yeah, telling our story. Oh, bless you. And thank you for yeah, your I won't say courage, but I've really enjoyed our conversation. And bless you for yeah coming to speak today. Thank you, Mark.
Thanks, Piers. Keep doing what you're doing, mate. It's really important.
Thank you. Bless you. Take care.